Hello, and a very warm welcome on behalf of Open Britain to a discussion which touches all of us on something which is very important to all of us, the state of our democracy now. In the course of British history, our democracy, of course, has come under threat, but that's usually been from foreign enemies. Now that threat comes from within. Our own complacency, the belief that British democracy is somehow a beacon to the world, that we are home to the mother of parliaments and somehow the infants are going to follow us. Patronising, yes, silly, perhaps, but certainly dangerous too. The truth is that we have taken for granted a British system of government for years, despite its obvious failures. We've come to accept that so-called landslides in Parliament are built, in the case of Boris Johnson, on just 43.6% of the vote, and the same was similarly true for Tony Blair and his landslides too. We've had our lives changed by a supposedly advisory referendum on Brexit merely because that suited the needs of one particular party rather than the result of popular demand. We've accepted that some forms of proportional representation are fine for people in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, but not for some reason for people in England. And in 2015, we accepted that 3.8 million voters who voted for UKIP got one MP, Douglas Carswell, who then quit the party. So almost 4 million of our fellow citizens got nothing. So we're here with distinguished guests who've got very different political ideas and views, but come together on one big idea, that something is wrong with our British system of democracy. Sclerotic, in fact, perhaps not very democratic. We hope over the next 90 minutes or so to start the discussion, to hear your questions, to come up with some ideas and begin to renew our great British democracy. So let's begin by hearing from some friends in Europe and the United States who share our belief that democratic systems need to be reinvigorated to inspire trust rather than irritation and apathy. First, here's Omri Price from Alliance for Europe.
Hi, my name is Omri Price, and I'm the Managing Director of Alliance for Europe. Now, I'd like to give a big thank you to the Open Britain team for inviting me today and for hosting this important event. Now, in many ways, the question of how to make democracies work is one of the key questions that we could be asking in our times. And that's because our democracies and our societies are facing such acute existential questions and challenges that we really need to address. And the ability of democracy to respond to questions and challenges through citizen participation is what makes democracy possible at all. And it's only through that system of government that we know is very imperfect, but it's only through that that we can have our liberties, our quality of life, and our way of living in an inclusive and diverse society. Now, those questions, whether it's climate change or emerging technologies or social inclusion, they remain just as relevant across the European Union, where I am in Brussels today, and across the Channel in the UK. Now, especially in the post-Brexit reality, it's extremely important that we as civil society and active citizens remain engaged with one another, remain in conversation and in relationship with one another, working together to see how we can campaign together, how we can find new ways of activating people and really have citizens shape the agenda and shape the kind of future that we want to be living in. So I'll be engaged with all of you at the event today. And then I'm happy to stay in touch with all of you. Please follow Alliance for Europe on social media. Feel free to reach out, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of the discussion. So thank you very much. That's all for me, and take care.
Thank you, Omri. Well, many of us have also followed with considerable alarm efforts at voter suppression in the United States, plus gerrymandering and inventive ways in which minorities and others are discouraged or even prevented from voting. Here's Paku Hang from Vote Run Lead.
Hi, friends. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of your conversation on the state of democracy in Britain. My name is Pak Koo Heng, and I'm the Chief Program Officer at Vote Run Lead. And the fragility of democracy is a question that we in the United States are grappling with ourselves. But I'm reminded of the story of Rosa Parks and how the civil rights movement began in the United States because Rosa Parks would not give up her seat on a bus to a white man. Now, contrary to popular beliefs, her actions were not spontaneous. She trained for moments just like that. She studied nonviolent tactics, and she was in community with other people who shared her values. And so while yours and my democracy may be in peril, let's draw inspiration from people like Rosa Parks, and let's not give up. Let's nurture our democracy by voting for intersectional, anti-racist, reform-minded people. Let's protect it by fighting against ridiculous laws that would suppress voting and restrict who can vote. And let's renew our commitment to the ideals that are enshrined in your Magna Carta and in my Constitution. Friends, Vote Run Lead may be an ocean away, but please know that we have your backs and we are in this fight with you all. Thank you.
Aku, thank you. Now let's introduce our distinguished panel. Peter Jukes is an author and journalist and founder of Byline Times, a newspaper which repeatedly highlights the dangers to our democracy and to journalism. Kleiner Jordan is one of the founders of Make Votes Matter, an organisation which argues that proportional representation is the key to making Parliament more representative of the people of our country. Tom Brake is a former Lib Dem MP, now with Unlock Democracy. Welcome, Tom. Gracie Bradley is Director of Liberty, and the first thing you see on the Liberty website is, and I quote, "There is a democratic crisis in the United Kingdom. The government are shutting accountability in Parliament, through the courts, on the streets, and in civil society." Welcome, Gracie. And our final panelist is Dominic Grieve, a former Conservative MP and Attorney General who is a model of clarity when it comes to discussing some of the current difficulties within British democracy. Welcome to you all. So I'm going to begin by asking each panelist to speak for a couple of minutes on how they see the state of British democracy now. We'll engage in a discussion for about half an hour. We'll then throw things open for questions, which I hope we'll see on the screen, and I'll read out from you, our audience, so keep them coming. And you can raise them on the chat function. I'll put as many of those questions, obviously, as possible in the time allowed. Finally, I'll ask each of our contributors to sum up, to reflect on what we've discussed and suggest what we can do next. And we'll also hear some reflections from Mark Kieran of Open Britain. So let's begin with Peter. Peter, just give us some opening thoughts about where you think we are and what are the dangers to our democracy as you see it.
Well, I think Britain's in a very parlous state. I'm 60 years old. I've never seen it quite so feeble and a constitution creaking. But also, we are looking at a global phenomenon. So I think just maybe I just as a journalist, as somebody recently became a journalist, pitch in about a global phenomenon, you see, which is two factors really. You know, there's chaos everywhere, apparently, but the underlying force in a lot of the chaos around QAnon, this conspiracy theory in the US, or COVID denialism you see here now, and anti-vaxxer movements, internet giants. So our publishing has been dominated, billions sucked out of traditional news organizations by organizations like Facebook, Google, and these big tech companies are completely unaccountable. So that is a common factor, whether it's disinformation on Brazil on WhatsApp or disinformation on the biggest Facebook pages are often COVID denialists. The other thing, and Dominic knows more about this, especially from his chairmanship of the Intelligence Committee, is global flows of dark money. So you have dirty data on one side, unaccountable, illegitimate, unverified information. And then globally, this money flowing around to offshore funds, a shadow banking system is huge, which can pour into these democracies, which they are not obviously paying taxes in. Sometimes there's legitimate non-domiciled media owners, but often, as we've seen with, say, the interference by Russia or the effect of Russian oligarchs on the city and political donations, that a country, people are very remote from the country, a country they don't even live in necessarily, can affect it. I think those two forces, globalized money, disinformation, explain a lot of the current sort of populace and discomfort across the world.
Peter, thank you. Let's move on to Kleiner now. And Kleiner, I mentioned PR as part of your offering here, but maybe you could just sum up where you see the problem, because Peter concentrated very much on a global picture.
Sure. So thanks for having me. We at Make Votes Matter think that proportional representation is key to building a real democracy. Most of the time we are governed by governments that most people voted against. And that's obviously not real democracy. And it's kind of over 100 years since, it's almost 100 years since we last had a government that had majority support from voters, a single party government with majority support from voters. So Make Votes Matter is the national campaign for PR. We actually just started in 2015 after the most disproportionate election ever. And we spearhead a movement of many organizations, parties, people, public figures who are all pushing for PR. And we see proportional representation, or equal votes as we like to call it, it's less of a mouthful, as key to seeing the outcomes that we want to see in our society. And the evidence from around the world.
Oh, Kleiner, you seem to have frozen. Your screen seems to have frozen. Perhaps we can come back to you. Let's move on to Tom Brake of Unlock Democracy. Tom.
Thank you very much, Gavin. So you'd expect me to say, for starters, that one of the problems with our democracy is that we don't have a written constitution, and that's what Unlock Democracy campaigns for. And a written constitution would lock in some fundamental principles or values about our democracy, which couldn't then be overturned by a simple majority. Other areas in which our democracy are weak, and Kleiner was in the middle of highlighting one, which is a voting system which doesn't allow equal votes. In other words, people's views as expressed in the ballot box aren't actually then reflected in what happens in Parliament. Another major weakness, I think, with the UK's democracy is that we have a very centralised, probably the most centralised system of government anywhere in the OECD, which means that local communities, really their voices are not heard, and far too much is driven from the centre. In terms of things that are happening in the UK Parliament at the moment, which I think are going to inflict further damage on our democracy, there's a whole raft of legislation going through at the moment, whether it's the Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Bill, whether it's the Elections Bill, the Judicial Review and Courts Bill. These are things that will damage our democracy. We have almost casual cronyism now in the way that the government distribute funds, in the way that people are appointed. The battles going on, for instance, within government about trying to get Paul Dacre appointed as the chair of Ofcom is a very good example. He failed the interview at the first attempt. The government are now trying to rig the system to get him selected or appointed at the second attempt. And finally, I just flag up the fact that there is very poor scrutiny of government decisions, particularly, for instance, around finances. So during the COVID crisis, the government shifted a huge amount of spending into the contingency fund, which means that really there is no financial control or no ability for members of parliament to question how money is being spent. So we have a democracy which is under threat, and it's a democracy which we must all be willing to fight to defend.
Tom, thank you. I think we can go back to Kleiner now. Kleiner, are you there?
Yes. Hi. Sorry about that. Yeah, so just to pick up where I think I lost you all, I was just talking about the outcomes of proportional representation. which in brief is that you see more equal societies, countries that take faster action on the climate crisis and have better environmental protections, and have all sorts of other benefits, like people being more engaged with democracy, feeling that their voices are heard, their votes are counted, more diverse representation. And actually, there's even evidence that countries with proportional representation go to war less. So it's quite striking, and it sounds a little bit too good to be true, but the evidence is there. So we think this is crucial to not only fixing democracy, but actually building a real one in the first place. The way we go about this, we've got the Alliance. I've referenced all of these organisations and parties that are involved. It's actually all of the British opposition parties, aside from Labour, are already in the Make Votes Matter Alliance, alongside organisations like Unlock Democracy, Open Britain, the Electoral Reform Society. And so we're working together to bring about change. There's another coalition that's working specifically on getting Labour to back PR. That's called Labour for a New Democracy. And the Labour Party is the only opposition party not yet fully supporting PR. And we think that there's a real chance of getting them to back it at this conference. 83% of Labour members want PR, and we've got about half of CLPs have put forward motions on PR to conference. So we're very much hoping that it will get through conference. And finally, the other part of the campaign is the grassroots. So we've got people all over the country, local groups taking action, having street stalls, dropping banners from bridges, making lots of noise for equal votes. And so with those three parts, we believe that we can get there. And I think we can't do it soon enough, basically. We've just heard last night that the Conservative government has now put in more first past the post into the elections bill just before it goes to committee stage. So they're wanting to use that for mayors and police and crime commissioners, which would be a big backwards step. So obviously we're going to be challenging that and trying to make sure that we don't go backwards rather than forwards.
Thank you for now, Klein. Now we've outlined some of the problems. We've got two suggested solutions, PR for one thing, and Tom talking about the question of a written constitution. Let's move on to Gracie now. Gracie Bradley, go ahead, Gracie.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. So I join you all from Liberty. We are one of the oldest human rights organisations in the UK, and we're independent of any political party, neutral on Brexit, and our mission is really to stand up to power, the same as it was in 1934. And we at Liberty are really concerned that our democracy and our fundamental rights and freedoms are under really significant threat at the moment. This government is waging an all-out war on the accountability mechanisms that we all use to hold power to account. And as we heard earlier, that's happening in court, that's happening in Parliament, at the ballot box and on the streets. So first, the government is taking aim at the laws and legal processes that all of us use to challenge the decisions of government and those of other public authorities and entities. So our Human Rights Act is under threat, as is a legal process called judicial review. We're also seeing that Parliament, as a check on executive power, is being increasingly sidelined. And that's something that has really accelerated and been catalysed throughout the pandemic, where we've seen really significant restrictions on our liberties passed essentially by the stroke of a minister's pen, scrutinised by Parliament, weeks after those measures have come into force. And even then, only with a straight yes or no vote, no opportunity to amend. So that's a process that's been catalysed throughout the pandemic, but of course was ongoing before, with the proliferation of the use of secondary legislation, for example, and of course that infamous prorogation in 2019. We're also really concerned about people's ability to speak out at the ballot box, and several speakers already have mentioned the elections bill, which in particular proposes voter ID legislation that will indeed suppress the votes of people in particular from minoritized groups, people who are already underserved by our political system. And finally, of course, the government is taking aim at people's ability to hold them accountable in the streets, and the Policing, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Bill is a really significant threat to our fundamental freedom to protest. And as has been said by people in the judiciary, rights worth having are unruly things. That doesn't seem to be something that this government agrees with. And the provisions of the Policing, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Bill, while also touching on other areas of life in respect of protest in particular, essentially will make it easier for the police to impose conditions on protest, will lower the threshold at which people are criminalised, and will raise the penalty that people face for breaching conditions, all of which will have a really significant chilling effect on people's freedom to protest, and indeed is likely to create more confrontation between police and protesters. And police themselves have expressed scepticism about how useful these new powers will be to them. So, as I say, we're facing a real set of significant threats to our democracy at every turn at the moment, and in particular to our civil liberties. But the final thing that I would say is that, we should view this, yes, it's an attack, but it's a response to the fact that actually those accountability mechanisms do inconvenience people in power. They do force decisions to be changed. They are effective at holding power to account. So we shouldn't be too demoralized because the point is this is a response to our collective power, and it's something that we need to maintain.
Gracie, for now, thank you. Let me bring in Dominic Grieve on that, because there were a lot of specific issues there, Dominic, but also behind all that is the question of the power of the courts, the power of the executive, and as Tom said, we don't actually have a written constitution, and this to many people is a kind of soup. I just wonder where you are in all this.
Firstly, I should say I'm pretty much in agreement with most of the things I've just heard from each of the speakers in their own analysis of the issues. I think we need just to step back a moment and ask ourselves, why is this happening? And I don't think it's just because we don't have proportional representation, for example. Historically, the UK, although it didn't have PR, had effectively a form of internal coalitions within political parties, although at the moment that seems to have foundered. Secondly, the United Kingdom had well built-in understandings through conventions that there were limits to what a government with a majority ought to do. Now, both those things seem to me to be eroding very quickly and to have almost vanished. We certainly saw it with the prorogation of Parliament in 2019. Why is this happening? Well, I think actually Peter Jukes touched on it rather well, which is that we're living in a world where I think there are a large number of really intractable and difficult issues: climate change, mass migration, topics to which politicians don't actually have answers. You've got a public which is increasingly anxious about these matters, and politicians have found that the displacement activity of populist politics is in fact easier for them than addressing those underlying matters. And with it, politics gets more hysterical, precisely because it's being whipped up, I'm quite sure, by social media in part. And we are in a new world where democracy becomes increasingly chaotic, winner takes all, until the moment when that democracy founders, the government gets overthrown and replaced by another. That's not where we should be. Now, I've often said we could have a written constitution, but I'm a realist. We're not going to get a written constitution before the tone of the politics is changed, which is why I think proportional representation is probably the first step in the right direction. But you've got to think through an analysis of why this is happening, rather than just saying, well, we're in the wrong place, we've got to change it, because without it, we won't actually get the right steps to altering this. The two main political parties have an obvious vested interest for the maintenance, for example, of the status quo on proportional representation. So I do think we need to think all that through if we are to get a better and more reasoned political environment, which at the moment is eluding us, not just here, United States, and I have to say in quite a few European countries, including some which have a measure of PR, which is why we have to be, I think, realistic about moving this forward.
Excellent from all of you. Thank you. Let me try and bring some of these threads together and play a bit of devil's advocate. I mean, as Dominic said, let me pick up that last point of Dominic's. There are countries with written constitutions which have similar problems. We've heard from the United States. There are countries with proportional representation which have similar problems because, as Peter and you've all kind of echoed, these are global issues. The threat to democracy is global. We've heard it from our earlier speakers. So where do we start? The positive things I would suggest to you are that PR is Peter, but let's begin with Peter, but please chip in if we can. Trying to achieve proportional representation is something which can be done. A written constitution may follow, and some of the other issues, such as the nonsense on Facebook and some of these other extremist, the misinformation and disinformation and the populism that follows, are more difficult. So Peter, start with PR because that's where we can actually score a victory.
Yeah, and for my over half century, I've been talking about PR since I was a kid. Obviously, there are blocks to it, and the AV vote in 2011, which I think Dominic Cummings was one of the first to get involved in, and the regional assemblies getting, an English parliament or regional parliaments didn't work. It is, I mean, maybe it's a problem of perception. I suppose my point about pointing to the global sphere, because I completely agree on what everybody's saying about the Constitution and what Gracie is saying about the climate bill, the acts on the electoral bill. One key element in the electoral bill, which people have missed beyond the voter ID, which incredibly is Republican-style voter suppression. The government has said itself, 5 million people can't get access to voter ID on its online harms bill. So it's omitting. That has been imported. So this globalization, we talk about migration, the globalization of money and ideas. Now, here's two measures. I think they were first suggested by the DCMS committee, which looked into Cambridge Analytica and Russian interference, was that a Foreign Agents Registration Act, which they have in America. Instead, we've gone the reverse way. That was one simple recommendation. If somebody's working for a foreign power, fine, declare it. If you're putting money into election, declare it. America has that. There's some big prosecutions that came up during Trump's and still to come under that act. That would secure us from those outward flows of money. And I think the bill goes backwards. This recent bill, this is before Parliament now, actually allows non-domiciled ex-residents of the UK. There's a 15-year limit which they can finance political parties. That's now removed. So Conservative Party or the Labour Party can take money, no representation without taxation, yet they massive representation, these big donors. We've tracked on Byline Times 150 million in the last 10 years from donors paying over £100,000. So I don't think PR alone fixes that problem of power, money, and influence, and people not standing in the constituencies, standing in the country which they're seeking to influence.
Klein, I know you're not saying PR alone, but let me again put the devil's advocate point. We had a chance to vote in it. Actually, most people either couldn't be bothered or it lost. So I'm completely in favour of it, but that is the problem. And the wider issue is that are people actually engaged in constitutional issues when they have so many other things to think about? It's easy to take a particular politician or a policy and say, I don't like that. But to say you don't like the system, we've got to change it. It does sound a bit theoretical, doesn't it, Kleiner?
Well, you've set me up perfectly for one of my favourite hashtags, which is AV is not PR. There was a referendum in 2011 on the voting system, but the alternative vote system that was offered as a replacement for first past the post is not a proportional system. And all of the evidence shows that it's the proportionality actually that's linked with the better outcomes. And so some would say AV is a better system because you vote preferentially, and that means that you get somebody you voted for somewhere down the line. Whereas actually with proportional representation systems, everybody gets somebody that they actually voted for. I'm not going to go into the detail of voting systems because generally that's something that a lot of people don't want to hear a lot about. And I think that kind of links into the question about whether electoral reform is a boring constitutional issue. And I think this is a way in which electoral and democratic reformers, we shoot ourselves in the foot a bit, because actually think about Brexit, think how energized and passionate and all of the other things that happened about Brexit, and that was a massive constitutional issue. And so where the people are actually given a real choice, then they will engage. And I would say that the referendum on AV was something that nobody was campaigning for really at the time. And so that there wasn't a lot of passion to change it. And as you say, there was a very low turnout. And I often explain the difference by saying, like, if you're offered 2 different types of apple and actually you want a banana, it's just a completely different thing. So that's not what we wanted. I did want to pick up on the kind of idea that people often say PR is not a panacea. And of course it's not. Nothing is a panacea aside from an actual panacea. And so, of course, all sorts of other things need to happen as well. But we see PR as the very necessary keystone that enables us to build the rest of the democratic blocks around it. So without having a parliament that's representative, it's going to be very hard to sort out the House of Lords and all of the other things that we want to see.
Tom Brake, I started off this discussion by saying that one of our problems is complacency, and it is so interesting to me how many people still talk about the glories of an unwritten constitution, as if we're sort of in the 19th century where it's pure gold as opposed to paper money. I mean, is that inertia? Is that part of the inertia in actually engaging people and recognizing that we've got to do something?
Well, I think part of the problem is people can't see what our constitution amounts to, and I think that is one of the arguments, one of the strongest arguments for having a written constitution that people could become familiar with, that be part of education at school and so on, that people would almost carry around with them in their wallet, in the way that in the US clearly people do. I think we do have a big challenge, which you highlighted, about the extent to which people will engage in discussions or interested in discussions about written constitutions or other democratic reforms. Our challenge, and organisations like Unlock Democracy and other organisations in the sector, I think our challenge is to make these issues something that are not a pure sort of academic discussion, but are matters that people can relate to their everyday lives. So a good example might be, if we had in a written constitution, we had set out that what the powers, for instance, of local government were, and that central government couldn't simply take them away at any moment in time, which they have done successively. Successive governments have done over the last 30 or 40 years. When a parent, complains about, I can't get my child into the local school, if local councils had retained the powers over local schools, that is a matter that would be much easier to resolve than the present system, where schools are in effect independent, and any oversight is provided by central government. So we've got to make these things connect with people's everyday lives, and I accept that is a big challenge for us, and that is the work that we must pursue vigorously.
Gracie, I was wondering, trying to think of what brings some of these global factors and the dirty money that Peter was talking about together with our problems. And one of the thoughts I had was this whole question of, if you say to people, and I've done quite a lot of public meetings talking about this, about the House of Lords, there is a great deal of skepticism about what this body is supposed to do and why it is a repository for some people who have either not done very well in politics or who've given large sums of money. I mean, is that another possibility, a place to begin to roll some of this back and change things? Agree?
Me, yeah. I mean, I think it's definitely a possibility. I mean, I think I would really draw on what Tom just said about making things matter to people and helping people to understand how these things affect them close to home. And I think that that's what we've been trying very hard to do when it comes to government proposals on judicial review and on the Human Rights Act, is to take some of these things out of the very lofty corridors of power and explain to people, well, actually, you know, judicial review is something that people have used to, you know, challenge being placed in care homes and not being able to leave and see their families. It's something that children who've been born here but who haven't been able to pay £1,000 to register their citizenship, they've used judicial review, for example, so that they can stay in the country and live their lives as they should be able to. So I think there's something really, you know, I understand kind of the Westminster intrigue dimension of all of this, and I know that it resonates with some, but I think that there's a kind of much broader, deeper kind of political education piece to be done, so that people really understand what it is that underpins those mechanisms that affect them in their everyday lives and understand how that they can use them themselves.
I'm going to throw it open to questions from the audience in just a minute, but Dominic, just one thing that's always slightly puzzled me is the 2015 election, which we noted earlier, produced different big parties in the different areas of the United Kingdom. Scotland's got the SNP as the largest party, DUP in Northern Ireland, Labour in Wales, and in England, the Conservative Party. And yet, in many ways, England has been left behind in this. What, you know, the demands for PR, which function in different parts of our democracy, seem to function reasonably well, even in Northern Ireland, would you believe, or different voting systems at least. Why is there not great demand or greater demand for this in England?
Well, I think we need just to sort of get our ideas in place. It may be that proportional representation, if offered to England or the United Kingdom or the United Kingdom Parliament, might well, in the 10 years that have passed since we last looked at it with AV, not a very good system, actually enjoy more support. The issue is that England is a unitary state and has been since the 9th century. There is a demand for localism, but there isn't a demand for regionalism, which is where there's been a tendency to say, oh, well, we might grant you PR for that. And of course, the United Kingdom is not capable of being turned into a federal state. I think we've just got to get away from that. It will not work. So for those reasons, I think people have tended to park this issue. And I think this is why I think we have to be really quite objective and realistic. Yes, we can go for a written constitution. The written constitution involves massive upheaval about, is it entrenched? Is it ultimately the judiciary who make the decisions as to what is lawful under the constitution or not? Can it be changed by a straight majority in the House of Commons? In which case it's not very different from the semi-written constitution that we've got today. And similarly, just looking at House of Lords, the House of Lords is badly in need of reform. But actually, about 250, 300 members of the House of Lords do a perfectly good job reviewing legislation, looking at its minutiae, and occasionally pinging it back to the House of Commons and saying, please think again. The trouble is, it's also got a very large number of people who shouldn't be there because they've frankly got almost nothing to contribute at all. Now, you can make an argument for an elected second chamber, but I would park that as to be of secondary importance, although I do accept that some of its antics of one or two of its members are extremely demeaning and is not a good place. I would focus on what is actually deliverable, and that's got to be at a UK level if you're going to bring about change. And I think you should start by building on what previously has made the UK constitution work quite well and say, well, as it's not working now, but it worked well in the past, what improvement can we bring to it, which the public may actually say, actually, I think that's a good idea, without going along and saying we want to rewrite the whole thing. Because I think incremental change here is the only way forward. Otherwise, you're going to lose your public quite quickly.
That's a very interesting point. So, I mean, a number of you, Gracie in particular, was saying, and Tom, we've got to make it relevant to people. Just to sum up this before we throw it open to the rest of our audience, what would connect? What would be popular? What do you think you can sell? Gracie first, but do join in, the rest of you. What do you think you could make as a selling point rather than saying we're going to overhaul the entire constitution?
Oh, I mean, that's a huge question. I think that I think that we've done a lot of work at Liberty looking at this in respect of the Human Rights Act and judicial review in particular. And I think we've learned quite well what doesn't work, which is really technical stuff that is fronted by lawyers and seems very far away from everything. I think people also don't really believe kind of conspiratorial narratives that the government is out to get them, even though it may look that way. And so I think it's quite important to explain to people that these are mechanisms that are here for catching things when they go wrong. And these are the really concrete ways in which they work and touch people's lives. And actually, the best spokespeople for things like this are the people who've used the Human Rights Act, who've used judicial review, who've been out protesting and so on. So I think it's actually been a lesson in humility. It's not always the director of Liberty that needs to be at the front of conversations like this. It's other people sometimes.
Tom, where would you start? What? Come on in there.
Well, I think one good place to start, and this has worked in other countries, is the idea that the public should actually be involved at the outset in negotiating and discussing and trying to resolve some of the biggest problems that we face. So the success in Ireland of the Citizens' Assembly that looked at abortion, for instance, a problem that was far too thorny for politicians to take on because they thought there were far too many risks associated with it. Yet that Citizens' Assembly came forward with proposals that then politicians felt comfortable with adopting, which I suspect they would never have put forward if it had been left to them. The Citizens' Assembly in France with climate change, although probably it's fair to say that Macron hasn't exactly implemented each and every single one of their recommendations. The fact is that the French government, and he has acted on some of those, and that process came forward with ideas and solutions again, which I suspect the government would have been rather wary of coming forward with themselves, but because they've got the protection of the people, that they were then able to adopt at least a significant number of those proposals. So that's one way forward, which I think the public would actually support.
Peter, it seems to me one thing that the public would support would be trying to clean up the money that you were talking about. Yes,
and in this way, I'm going to surprise Dominic Grieve and sort of have a sort of slightly conservative, sort of Burkean attitude to this. Actually inspired by my late lamented mentor, Tony Judd, the historian, who said, why do we keep on looking for impossible futures when we have some very reusable pasts? And I think there's some traditions like, the government is really trying to break down FOI. That's one form of transparency, which has been very useful for judicial review and for journalists. The ministerial code. What happened to that? I mean, I know it's a problem of enforcement. I know it's up to the Prime Minister, but actually in our independent civil service, all those things have been eroded. But, I have a question to Dominic about the lack of representation for England. It's the biggest nation in Europe which doesn't have a parliament. But just to go backwards to look at those things that worked and support them and develop them.
Okay, some questions have started to come in. I'm looking at the first one here. What about citizens' assemblies to rebuild trust in the system? And what do you make of that? Do you think if a citizens' assembly listened to you, they would take a view that actually some kind of better, fairer system is inevitable? Kleiner? No. Is everybody still there? Perhaps. Yeah. Well, let's maybe Gracie. What do you think about the idea of citizens' assemblies? Because the kind of points that you were making about judicial review, it seems to me, would.
Oh, there we are. Hi, sorry, my signal dropped out for a moment there.
Okay, Kleiner. Yeah, on citizens' assemblies, and then I'll go to Gracie.
Apologies for that. Yeah, so the citizens' assemblies are a fantastic tool for deliberating and figuring out how to improve democracy and all sorts of other issues. We explicitly advocate a citizens' assembly to choose the voting system. And so the Good Systems Agreement, which we brokered and launched a couple of years ago in the summer, actually sets out the principles of good voting systems, one of which, of course, is proportionality. But it also says it shouldn't be that the politicians get to choose the voting system they're elected on. So the people should be involved in that in a properly informed, deliberative way. When these have happened in other parts of the world, generally they're advocating for more proportionality. And it's a great way to hear like the voices of normal people who aren't involved in politics, who really just want their voices heard, and that they want the things like to have a safe, healthy life. They want to survive. So like people care about the fact that we're hurtling into this climate crisis, and having real democracy is one of the real ways to tackle that faster.
Gracie, I'm struck in the United States in particular. I attended quite a few focus groups where people were given quite difficult ideas. And what was interesting was most ordinary people want to come to some resolution and are prepared to change their minds. Whereas, of course, we have a parliamentary system where you have opposition and government, and they tend not to change their minds, at least when they get in parliament. I mean, is that one of the pluses of citizens' assemblies, that actually you might get people to come to some kind of consensus? And is it one of the dangers to the party system that isn't how we like to operate, or they like to operate?
Yeah, I mean, I think citizens' assemblies are such an interesting idea. And I think, especially if you can consider them from our parliament can be so adversarial and really tribal. And I think you get a whole different set of solutions when actually you sit people down together and think, well, let's approach this as a problem to try and solve collectively. Let's look at the range of options available to us and weigh them together, and let's be inquisitive, and let's chew it over. I'm always really, really struck by, you can do these sort of big media spots and everybody has their entrenched position and we all go back and forth and we know what everybody's going to say. But actually, when you sit down with people and you're a bit more inquisitive, I've had lots of interesting conversations with people about, lots of things that can feel really taboo, about vaccination, about migration, about war, all kinds of things that, these are day-to-day interactions, taxi drivers, whoever, and so on. And actually, when you're there having that interaction with another person and you're being inquisitive and you're not being adversarial, you find that actually you come to completely different places. But also, even if you don't agree, you can often understand where someone else is coming from. And that means that you approach your solution in a completely different way. I think citizens' assemblies are a really interesting idea. I mean, obviously, there's always that tension, particularly when it comes to certain areas of human rights and human rights advocacy, where you want to say, well, actually, we don't just want to offer this up to the majority, because actually the majority might do something that's really going to be quite detrimental to the minority. So I think there is always that kind of balance. But I think getting people more involved in inquisitive participatory processes can only be a good thing.
Dominic, I was struck by something you said right at the start, almost as an aside, which is essentially that the big political parties were always coalitions anyway. And I just wondered if something has gone wrong within the parties, that they tend, because of what Peter was talking about, they tend to move to extremes, and that is a real problem. Dominic?
Yes, I think it has. I think that is the major reason why we have some aspects, not all, of the current crisis, and the sort of winner-takes-all attitude that exists within the current government, for example. The coalitions used to be quite delicate and recognized as such, and it had the merit, interestingly, of suppressing extremism. And I just think that we've lost that, and the Labour Party has been through a not entirely dissimilar process. And the truth at the moment is that Keir Starmer is grappling with it and is unable to resolve it. I have to say, my personal opinion is that the Labour Party is irrevocably and irremediably divided, and who's ever going to deal with that fact, I don't know, and which creates paralysis. The Conservative Party at the moment has solved it by chopping off bits of itself and going for a populist agenda which has commanded electoral support. Now, that is one of the reasons why I think that proportional representation has a real something to offer. But we've got to get the right form of proportional representation. I don't wish to end up with Israeli proportional representation, where in fact you're so divided up that you end up with the extremes controlling the centre. Actually, the model that Scotland and Wales has pretty good. I mean, it may be capable of adjustment, but top-up lists don't look bad. And I don't think the world has come to an end in terms of constituency representation. So I think there are sensible ways forward which will oblige governments in office and political parties to look around them and have dialogue. As for the points that were made about citizens' assemblies, I think they've got a real useful role to play as long as they're focused so as to raise issues. We all know as politicians, certainly me as a politician, that if you get politicians of different parties, quite apart from the same parties, together in a room in private, you start getting very high levels of agreement on practical problems. That's why those think tanks exist. That's why the Ditchley Foundation, of which I'm a trustee, does good work. But the trouble is you try and get a government minister who's busy to go and spend 2 days talking about something in an abstract way, or actually for that matter, leading opposition MPs. It's very, very difficult. And that's one of the problems that we have. News management, presentational politics, the internet, which Peter was commenting on, the immediacy of response, the fact you can go from hero to zero in 5 minutes because of internet trolling. All these things have introduced for politicians a series of problems which makes rational decision-making and rational dialogue very difficult.
Peter, someone else has asked the question, does our media need reform? I feel like current press has a negative impact on democracy. Now, that could both be the traditional media, breakthrough media like Byline Times, and also the people you were talking about, the Facebooks and others.
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing is, I gave up a quite content and enjoyable career as a dramatist to become a journalist, which involves trolling and lots of legal threats. Quite exciting, I must say, compared to drama, because of that very crisis. And when I first, I mean, you know, it begins with press barons. It's always happened. And we look at the role of Murdoch and phone hacking, influence on Prime Minister. And when I wrote my first book about Murdoch in 2012, after the phone hacking scandal, I did say the monopoly he had, and he had 50% of the revenues of Fleet Street, which is monopoly power, anything over 25% could be monopoly power, would be dwarfed by the growth of what I called GAFA, wasn't it? GAFA, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple. And that has happened. But there's some rosy-tinted nostalgia about this. People don't pay for journalism anymore. Byline Times, we get them to pay. We have 18,000 subscribers. Quick plug there. But they never did. That is the problem. They paid for the copy, and advertising paid for the journalism. Nearly invariably, you know, the print edition 10p for the Times, that's not paying for the content. That's not paying these well-heeled columnists. It's the advertising. The disaggregation of advertising away from media to the big giants is a monopoly problem. And almost, I'd say, it's a technical fix. There is a problem with the journalist ecosystem is that they do not produce, Facebook does not produce journalism. It basically capitalizes and sells your data back to you. Basically, you're the product, it's free, but it sells your data to advertisers. Now, when that happened at the end of the 19th century with oil and railroads, we had Theodore Roosevelt, the trust busting. You know, I think, and America's moving this way, there are economic underlying the problems in journalism, which create the problems in politics, are simple problems, not simple, are big problems we dealt with before, and this case is global monopolies.
Teddy Roosevelt is a great hero of mine, especially his wonderful phrase, malefactors of great wealth. But anyway, we'll move on from that. But this is one for Kleina, actually. A question about the devolved nations. Can the panel comment on this? How can the democratic deficit, I think this is referring to England, suffered under this government be remedied? Because Dominic pointed out, England is not going to be a federal structure. There is no English parliament. What can we do about the democratic deficit in England? And I alluded to the fact that nearly 4 million UKIP voters in 2015 ended up with nothing, and that seems manifestly unfair. This goes beyond PR, though, doesn't it?
It does, but I think a key part of the answer is PR, both like for its own sake, but also, as I said, for the enabling that it would bring of the other parts of democracy that we need to improve. So yes, we've had some devolution, and I would say that we need more. I have to emphasise we are a single issue campaign for PR for the House of Commons at Make Votes Matter, but it seems obvious to me, and I think many.
I think we've frozen again. Tom, you come in. Yes.
Just on the question of devolution, I think that is what we need to see at an England level.
Go ahead.
I think we need to see devolution at an England level, and I think there's broad agreement about that. I think the difficulty arises as soon as one tries to define what that devolution looks like, because obviously there was the attempt under Labour to have a regional assembly in the northeast, and that people didn't vote for that. I think the idea of imposing an extra layer of regional politicians across England wouldn't go down well. So I think we're left with something which is devolution a la carte, where local authorities should be able to choose without the government telling them what the options are, should be able to choose what powers they want to exercise themselves, because then I think people will find that they have a much greater ability to influence their local politicians if they're responsible for, say, transport or environment in their area, than they have the ability to influence the Secretary of State for Transport sitting in Whitehall. And I think that would help to redress the balance. I think an English Parliament would come with it as many problems as we have currently, in terms of being very top-heavy in respect of the other nations in the United Kingdom.
Dominic, one way this could be solved is, just to pick up Tom's point, is the great cities of England. I mean, we're not talking about restoring the Kingdom of Cornwall or Wessex or whatever, but what might work is, say, Andy Burnham or Liverpool or Birmingham with a Conservative mayor, more powers for these great cities of England, particularly in the north.
As a traditionalist, I build on the building blocks, which are indeed great cities. And I would, prior to the 1950s, these cities financed themselves. They raised their own revenue and they spent it. And they had a high level of autonomy, and participating in civic government was regarded as being an extremely good thing to do. The trouble is they've now been turned by our system into agents for distributing central government money, usually with central government strings attached to the way it's done. So not surprisingly, they lose credibility and the interest of their electorate. So I certainly agree that that's where I would go. And any other thing I simply say is that we've had counties since the 9th century as well. And although those counties are sometimes eccentrically sized, I do happen to think that they are a good building base for local sentiment, local loyalty, and local governmental structures. And I would build on that and give them too greater autonomy, and indeed a range of options as to how they wish to deliver their services. And I'd simply make this point: devolution does not necessarily mean that you bring centralization to an end. One of the complaints in Scotland is that although the centralization has gone from Westminster, it's now been concentrated in Edinburgh. And there are a lot of people in Scotland who are deeply unhappy with this trend, which is actually producing a form of centralized government much more assertive on them in their own place where they live than they ever had before. So I think we need to just be a bit careful about the models, because ultimately devolution down to lowest level where it can reasonably be delivered whilst maintaining the cohesion of certain common policies is, I think, very desirable, because it enhances the engagement of the people who are involved in it.
Dominic, I've spoken to people in Shetland who say we're nearer to Norway than we are to Edinburgh, but that's...
Well, they certainly don't like Edinburgh very much in Shetland or Orkney. I think they have very strong views on
it sometimes. Gracie, I think this one's for you. Do you think the requirement for voter ID will backfire on the Tories, as they are now, in effect, the party of the working class? I think that last bit might be somewhat contentious. But, I mean, do you think the voter ID thing, to many people, it just seems completely unfair?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's less about it backfiring on the Tories. It's more about it backfiring on everyone, ultimately, because so many people will be disenfranchised. And we know that those are people who are already underserved by our political system. And I think the latest research from the Electoral Reform Society says that it's people who have significantly disabled people, unemployed people, people without qualifications are all less likely to have photo ID than other people. And, you know, we shouldn't ignore that this event is taking place at the same time as people face a potentially catastrophic cut in universal credit. I think these are people who need really significant representation, and it's a real problem that they may be shut out of the kind of party political system and having their say at the ballot box. And I suppose the way in which it might backfire, and what we keep trying to say to the government about the policing bill, is that, you know, protests and civil unrest are kind of, you know, that's the last place that people go when they can't be heard anywhere else. So if you shut people down in court, if you shut people down at the ballot box, if you shut down all avenues to accountability, and then you say, if you go out and protest, actually, there's going to be really significant confrontation with the police, that's not something that's good for the government of the day. That's not something that's good for anybody.
Kleiner, there's a question about how we can stop the outcome of citizens' assemblies disappearing into the ether. And I've come across this problem in the United States, where sometimes people who've been involved in these kind of forums say, we have the right to be consulted, and then we have the right to be ignored, apparently. So it doesn't necessarily translate into something positive.
Yes, I think that there's definitely a danger there. And I think Extinction Rebellion have really shifted public perception of and the sense of urgency about the climate crisis in this country. And one of the things that they've always pushed for is citizens' assemblies. And they were successful in getting a citizens' assembly on the climate crisis. But unfortunately, because we've got a government that's so unrepresentative, first of all, the people involved in that didn't get to set the terms of reference, which is an important part of citizens' assemblies. And also then, of course, what happens with the recommendations afterwards? Like if the government doesn't like it, then there's nothing to actually make them do it. So actually having a representative parliament that can be held to account by voters, that knows that it's got to actually take notice of these democratic processes is a way to solve it. So unfortunately, whenever you come to me, I'm going to come back to PR as an answer for things. And unfortunately, I've got this really dodgy signal in a not very fancy hotel. So apologies for dropping out. But I was just saying about devolution. I think that's really important. But like a way to make sure that happens as well is by having a representative parliament. And it's fantastic on that front that Andy Burnham, the mayor of Greater Manchester, has come out for PR recently. And he's actually got a piece in the Chartist supplement for the Labour Party conference. So we're really hoping that those kind of interventions will help shift one of the two big parties so that we end up with a pro-PR parliament in the near future.
Well, let me pick up the point about parliament, because someone's asked, maybe come to Tom Brake on this. What steps do we need to get a less adversarial parliament in Westminster? I accept PR is going to be Kleiner's answer, and we're all in agreement with that. But that is part of the problem, isn't it? And Dominic's alluded to it too. It's you must be wrong because you're on the other side, which is not actually the way most of us conduct our lives.
Well, I think one of the interesting lessons that I learned as a minister in the coalition government was the extent to which we could find common ground with the Conservatives. And that was strange because I had spent the whole of my life, I mean, I joined the Liberal Party because of Margaret Thatcher. I'd spent the whole of my life actually fighting against the Conservatives, yet I could find there were certain areas where we had common ground. So, you know, the political parties can work together. And to some extent, people's perception of what happens in Parliament is distorted because the key events like Prime Minister's questions will give an impression of parties being at each other's throats, whereas a lot of the work that happens in committees and the committee stage of a bill sometimes, and certainly in select committees, is much more consensual than the appearance that people get. I mean, the one final comment that I would make is really around unfortunately the chamber itself, which clearly is designed to maximize conflict. There is perhaps going to be an opportunity, although I doubt the government will take it, if there is a a temporary chamber that is created when if the restoration and renewal project gets underway and the Palace of Westminster is completely overhauled, there would be an opportunity to create a temporary chamber with a different layout, which could then perhaps drive a completely different approach in Parliament from the political parties. But I'm not holding my breath as to whether the government might decide to go down that route in terms of that temporary chamber.
You did invite us to jump in. Just on this adversarial thing, I'd like a more inquisitorial Parliament. I mean, maybe Dominic, legal background, he could say that this sort of adversarial infection goes to the heart of our legal system. But a very simple thing, I mean, is the power of committees. So going back to that DCMS committee, Dominic Cummings, the chief architect of Vote Leave, refused to attend. It was held in contempt of Parliament. Nothing happened. And Rupert Murdoch and James Murdoch were sufficiently scared by the Sergeant at Arms turning up at whereas it was News International HQ. They did attend. But the powers to compel witnesses, the power of the oath, the subpoena, if you look at the American system, you know, that obviously can be misused politically, but the power those committees have both in the Senate and in the House of Representatives are very important, and a very important sort of step towards scrutiny. And those powers are latent there. They're just not being sort of engaged as far as I can see.
Dominic?
Just 2 points. I'm going to respectfully disagree, I think, with Tom about the shape and configuration of the House of Commons. It's a debating chamber, and its quality comes from the fact that people make debate rather than engage in set speeches. I know increasingly there may be set speeches, but when it's working because there's debate. And it's going to be a cockpit. It's going to be a place where people vent emotions. And I don't think you're ever going to change it. If you do change it, you're going to change it into something deadly boring. The truth is that the work is done elsewhere. It's done in the committees, if the committees were working properly. But bluntly speaking, the committees don't work very well because there's very little incentivization for MPs to give themselves over to doing proper committee work. And the select committees involve much too much grandstanding by MPs rather than asking questions. Now, Peter also made a really important point, which is about the powers of Parliament. The Emperor has no clothes. It is true that the House of Commons nominally can summon people who have lied to their committees, bring them at the bar of the House and lock them up. But because of practical modern rules, this is not compatible with a proper judicial process. This is crying out for reform. And if it were reformed, if there were set up a tribunal system so that somebody who lies to a committee of the House of Commons goes in front of a tribunal where they can get a fair hearing and actually be banged up afterwards for contempt, that would be a very good thing. But the current system cannot deliver that. And as an attorney, I used to be giving advice to the House of Commons. And I'm just gently pointing out that the powers look good on paper, but I'm afraid in reality, they don't work. So that's a reform that badly needs to happen. The standing orders of the House of Commons could do with review. They are, in fact, people don't realise this, but the standing orders are, in fact, the UK Constitution, or certainly its operational process manual. But very few people have ever paid attention, although one or two people do. And I have to say, over Brexit, I started paying much more attention to them, with results which, time to time, he surprised even me.
I'm going to bring in Klein in a moment. I'm just sort of amused by the thought that people who lie to Parliament and perhaps people who lie in Parliament should end up being banged up. That's a somewhat controversial issue these days. But anyway, Klein, you wanted to come in there. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to agree wholeheartedly with Dominic that actually that it's really important that we do bring our whole selves and our emotions and in politics as well as in other places. But I would say that I think what I would like to see is discussion, not debate. So actually listening to other people and being willing to adapt your position based on what they're saying. And I think that is linked to this whole idea about, in this country, coalitions. Coalition is a dirty word, but really it's about cooperation and collaboration. And that's actually how politics is done in most democracies. And they have circular chambers. Like we've got this chamber where it's literally 2 swords lengths apart because it was designed for dueling. And it's just archaic. And we don't need to be fighting each other. We don't need binary. We actually need the whole spectrum, and we all need to listen to each other and be able to come to something much more like consensus. So maybe a circular parliament would actually be a good idea. We need more grown-up politics.
Well,
yeah, but look at the Edinburgh Parliament, which I can assure you is not consensual at all, and they all have their own chairs and they all sit in the semicircle. And bluntly, it's incredibly boring, and anybody who goes there will realize it very quickly. So different countries have different models, but I think we may be tilting at the wrong target. There is a lot of capacity for MPs to work together, and they do it and would do it more if they were incentivized to do it. That's the one point I would make.
Well, I've sat through supposed debates in the US Senate, and I can tell you in the boring stakes, they're way ahead of most of us. Just a final question, I think, I'll bring in Peter first in this. Nigel Farage was an outsider with an originally minority view, who was never an MP, who has, in the view of the questioner, become more successful than many MPs. What lessons can we learn from this?
Well, that's one, I think, that goes back to the question of our, not our constitution, our national makeup. Which one had been, dogging the British state back to the 18th, 19th centuries, is that if you look at the vote, also the demographic of, I think Anthony Barnett's done this in his book, The Lure of Greatness, was that you take a typical post-industrial Scottish town, 2% in favour of Remain, and then a typical English industrial town, identical. I think it's Wigan and Raven. I can't remember the Scottish town he uses. Identical to post-economic demographic, favour of leave, that the Brexit vote was an English vote. So I think there is in Farage a kind of underlying, he tapped into that sense of unrepresented Englishness. And though I am Armenian Welshman, I've been brought up in England, brought to London, I have to now accept this culture. And I've written an essay on this. I am English. My mother, though Armenian, half Armenian, listened to the Archers. She loved Vaughan Williams' Lark Ascending. My culture is English. And we've got to, whether this affects the political state culturally, readapt to Englishness as this plural ethnic identity. With Farage in particular, I think the thing is that there is a whole new world of politainment. So Farage has now got his GB News show, is kind of the big lure after Andrew Neil. These people, I'm not saying Farage necessarily, there's much more money to be made into being on InfoWars in America. The guy runs InfoWars, worth about £80 million. To be a controversialist in the media sphere is much, and of course Farage rarely turned up to European debates, and when he did, Russia Today, RT was there to film him. I think this is partly, you could say politicians need to be paid more, but it is, politics is now, it used to be show business for ugly people. Now it's show business for greedy people.
Politicians need to be paid more, Dominic. That's not.
I'm just quickly going to come in with one point. I regret Farage didn't get into the House of Commons, because one thing about the House of Commons is it cuts people down to size jolly quickly. In the chamber particularly, and particularly those who come in with inflated pretensions about their own importance. And that's one thing which historically it's tended to do quite well. I'm not just thinking of Farage as a notional idea, but I've seen it happen with other people who've come in. This person is the great hope, and actually you quickly realise whether people have qualities which fit in with democracy. And parliamentary democracy and the give and take of politics. Otherwise, they end up just coming in and making speeches and disappearing out. And actually, they have very little impact. And I can think of a couple of people who've been like that.
We've only got about 10 minutes left. I wondered if each of you would mind just summing up in a minute or so, maybe beginning with Gracie there. I mean, what would you like people to take away from this, Gracie? What would you like us to think about and perhaps maybe communicate with each other again about? Gracie.
Yeah, interesting question. I think first of all, it's really important not to see all of these disparate attacks as disparate. It's really important to recognise what the cumulative impact of this will be, not just on democracy and not just on each of us, but also particularly on people who are already marginalized and minoritized. I think it's really important to be clear that the effects of what the government is doing at the minute are not going to be felt evenly. And there are immediate opportunities for action. The elections bill, the nationality bill, the policing bill, those are going through Parliament now. So if you haven't been in touch with your MP, if you haven't turned up at constituency surgery, now is the time to do it. It's all well and good kind of copying and pasting campaign emails that are drafted by organisations, but actually telling your MP in your own words why this matters to you, picking up the phone, going to the constituency surgery, that is what will make them listen. I also, obviously, please join Liberty. This is one of the most difficult times that we've had in our history. We are a membership organisation. We are run by our members. Our members are our board and our policy council, and it was really important to have people on board. But I think crucially, part of where I see us being, especially with the policing bill, I think it's because we have been defensive for a really long time. And I think often when things seem to be difficult, there's one school of thought that says, well, the political reality of this situation is this, so we should only ask for so much and we should be really moderate. There's another school of thought to which I think I and Liberty belong, which says, well, actually, when things are getting really, really difficult, now is the time to shoot for the moon. And it's really important not just to be defensive, but actually to think about and build and create, what we want to see in the world. What do we want society to look like? Who do we want to be cared for? How do we want to relate one another? So for all that there are all of these threats coming down the pipeline, I think it's really important to be together and do some of that really important politically imaginative work so that we can get closer to the world that we want to see.
Tom, would you like to sum up? What do you like people to take away from this?
Well, first of all, I don't want people to underestimate the risks that we are facing. So one very good example of that is the government's proposals around the Electoral Commission. Now, the Electoral Commission is an independent body that is supposed to oversee election spending by the political parties. The government are going to introduce a strategy and policy for the so-called Independent Electoral Commission, which is then going to be monitored by the Speaker's Committee on the Electoral Commission, which has a majority of Conservative members of Parliament on it. So we need to be aware of that threat, because that could have a significant impact on the Electoral Commission's ability to police elections in the future. But on the positive side, I think we need to recognise that we are much stronger together. We shouldn't underestimate the ability that people have to change a government's agenda. And I look back to one particular example, which I imagine Dominic Grieve will remember as well, in Coalition, when a campaign was built up around the government's proposals. I don't think it's exactly what the government were proposing, but this is what the campaign said, around proposals to privatise the forests. And that campaign built up to such an extent, got so many people behind it, that the government did a complete U-turn over that particular policy proposal. So there are times when sufficient numbers of people making sufficient noise can actually change the government's direction.
Tom, thank you. Peter, what are your kind of closing thoughts, as it were? Peter, you're muted just for a second. Can we unmute Peter?
I nearly got it right. I just build on what Tom and Gracie have said, and just being specific about this togetherness and social media, which is a curse. We've discussed its horrible side and the trolling and the dark money and things like that. It's also an enormous boon. I'm sure Gracie organises a lot on there, but obviously important CMPs. For example, we led on Byline Times about the GP data grab, which had been hidden. We wrote about it, people campaigned on it, it's been reversed. So there is this power in social media to build new networks. And another aspect of hope, apart from the apparent problems with GB News, is the culture wars, which Dominic rightly alerts us to, is the way that populist politicians distract from what they're doing with their left hand and all that money. There was a significant reversal over the Euro 21 finals or 2020 finals, played in 1921. When Saka, Rashford and Sancho, these three black players who lost penalties, were trolled, the amazing support they got and people turning out to monuments to them. So I always think of social media like the 19th century city. It's a new form of cyberspace. It's messy, it's chaotic, it's full of crime. Everybody's complaining about it, just like they did in those 19th century cities with all the pollution and the Dickensian crime. But we found, and the horse manure and then the cars, we found a way to live together. And I do think that, you know, there is something in this new moment. We're seeing all the bad sides, the many good sides that we can sort of, you know, adapt to and evolve to.
Thank you. Dominic, some closing thoughts.
I was struck, I think, by Tom's comment about the privatization of the forests. I happen to think my conversion to PR came in around 2013-14. Prior to that, I have to admit to you, I thought that the first past the post system had some merit. The change did in part come out of my experience of being in coalition with the Liberal Democrats. I think the coalition with the Liberal Democrats actually delivered good quality government. And it also enabled, interestingly, shifts to take place in the government's position, probably more easily, precisely because you could say it was a coalition. Therefore, if the Liberal Democrats were saying we're really unhappy about the privatization of the forests, that actually helped the government, the Conservative majority in the government, to say, well, in fact, we've got to pay some attention to this. It worked well. However, it is worth noting that the Liberal Democrats paid a very heavy price for going into it, one which, in my view, was entirely undeserved. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why proportional representation, if it institutionalizes the need to make those sorts of agreements and to look perhaps a bit more pragmatically about how governments deliver, I think is the first step in the right direction.
Thank you. Yes, junior partners and coalitions do seem to suffer. Kleine, just a final thought from you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's so lovely hearing Dominic's thoughts on that. Yeah, coalitions are definitely the way to go. We really need to learn to listen to each other and cooperate, collaborate more. And I also really loved what Gracie was saying. I think we really do need to co-create the country and the democracy that we want to live in. So we need to be the change that we want to see. In terms of what people can do, I'd say join the movement on the Make Votes Matter website. We've got a section called Quick Actions, so you can very easily do things without making a huge amount of effort that will have some impact. So in particular, at the moment, we've got our petition for less first past the post, not more. And that's a response to the government trying to bring it in for more elections at the moment. And so that feels really kind of urgent and important. So I would encourage you to go and sign that. And then obviously, if you want to be involved more, then we would very much welcome that. And I would encourage everyone who's been on the panel as well to join the Alliance if you're not already in it, so we can work together to make this a reality. And encourage everybody to take hope and take action, because without hope, we feel paralyzed. And there really is a path to a real democracy now. So let's make it happen together.
Thank you. Thank you, Kleine. Thank you all, actually, for being so inspiring, actually, and optimistic in points. Finally, to bring matters to a close, I'd like to ask Open Britain's Chief Executive Officer, Mark Kieran, to say a few words and to kind of sum up his thoughts about what we've learned.
Thanks, Gavin. What an excellent debate. Thank you, everyone, for the wide-ranging points that you've made. When we were organising this discussion, we did worry about making it 90 minutes instead of 60 for fear that it may fizzle out. And I'm very glad to see that it, very definitely didn't. If anything, we could go on much longer. My head is fizzing with ideas inspired by the comments that have been made. It's incredibly difficult to boil it down, to summarise it. But I think the key message that I'm taking away is, and this is from the panelists' comments as well as the comments that are coming in on the various channels on which we're streaming this event, is that democracy doesn't happen by default. I think people are beginning to realize that. They've taken it for granted for a while, but they are starting to see that it is not a default position. We have to stop thinking about democracy as a sort of once every 5 years event and start to think of it much more as a constant, almost daily struggle to defend and strengthen it and renew it indeed. And I think that's sort of very positive that that's becoming a sort of mainstream view. I think beyond that, I think it's interesting to note that the public, as well as people involved in this work, like ourselves and the panelists, are starting to see what the government are doing. This point that Gracie has made very eloquently this evening, that in and of themselves, the individual steps that this government are taking are pretty insidious. But when you take them together, they're just appalling. They're truly outrageous, suppressing voting, restricting our right to protest, frustrating our ability to hold them to account in the courts. It really is starting to people are starting to wake up to the extreme threat that represents. And I think finally, I'm really optimistic, I think, now about the fact that I can see people are itching to fight back. The people, having realized what is going on, are not just sitting back and shrugging and saying, oh, well, what can we do? People are aware that they can join the various organizations represented on the panel, that they can go to local meetings, that they can contribute to debates online, they can put pressure on their parliamentarians. I like that. I'm enthused by the fact that ordinary people are starting to realize that they can use the democratic system in that way. The reason I'm particularly optimistic about that is because we are working hard as part of a coalition of pro-democracy organizations, including Tom's and Kleiner's and many others, Fair Vote UK, the Electoral Reform Society, Hands Off Our Votes, lots of organizations. But the magic really happens whenever the public gets involved in massive numbers. And I do sense, just from the comments that we're seeing, from wider comments on social media, and from the points that are made by the panelists, that we are reaching a point where there may be a breakthrough point, and the public may finally stand up and give this government a piece of their collective mind. So I take some positivity from that. Gavin, there are lots and lots of other things that I've got on my list. I'm going to spend the next few days thinking about them and discussing them with the team. But in the interests of timely finish to this event, I'll hand back to you there.
Mark, thank you. That's all from me. That's all from our great panel. I hope we might all meet again in some way and continue to broaden this discussion with other people too. I think one thing we can all agree on is that this country may have enormous problems, but we also have enormous talent and enormous goodwill to try to come together somehow to solve them. The good news is, I think, we're better than this. So thank you for joining our discussion. Goodbye.